Step away from the counter now! The sharp command cuts through the luxurious jewelry store, stopping conversations mid-sentence. A black couple stands frozen, their faces a mix of confusion and indignation. The security guard's voice grows sharper as he steps closer, his hand hovering near his radio. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," he says, his tone cold and commanding. "Suspicious?" The woman's voice quivers with restrained anger. "We're just looking..." "Looking?" The guard interrupts, his words biting. "People like you don't just look in places like this." Gasps ripple through the store. A bystander inches closer, phone in hand, recording every tense moment. "Excuse me?" The man finally speaks, his voice steady but firm. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're here to shop, just like everyone else." "You can explain that in the security office," the guard snaps, gesturing toward the door. "No!" The woman's voice cracks with emotion. "You're humiliating us for nothing." The room feels like it's holding its breath. Then the man places a hand on his wife's shoulder and says quietly, "Let's go. We're better than this." Moments later, they walk out of the store, heads held high but hearts heavy. Behind them, the bystander uploads the video with a single caption. "Black couple harassed in luxury store. Why does this keep happening?" Within hours, the footage spreads like wildfire. Outrage builds, debates erupt, and the story ignites a national conversation. But what no one sees coming is the shocking truth about the security guard, the couple's surprising response, and the events that will change all their lives forever. What happened in that store? Why did the guard react that way? And how does this confrontation lead to something no one expected? We want to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Let us know in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if you're intrigued by this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another compelling, thought-provoking tale like this one. Together, let's uncover stories that inspire change and spark meaningful conversations. The Willow Creek Mall in downtown Atlanta thrived with activity on a warm Saturday afternoon. Shoppers bustled in and out of its sleek glass doors, arms filled with designer bags, while upbeat jazz music played softly from the overhead speakers. Among the throng of visitors, Damon and Celeste Harper strolled hand in hand, savoring a rare day off to celebrate their 7th wedding anniversary. Celeste's eyes sparkled as they approached the gleaming display window of Bentley & Company, a renowned jewelry store known for its exquisite custom pieces. "Let's take a quick look," she urged, tugging Damon gently toward the entrance. Damon smiled, his steady and calming demeanor always a balance to Celeste's enthusiastic curiosity. "Why not?" he said. "It's our day." The store was a picture of opulence. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across glass cases filled with glittering diamonds and gold. A sales associate stationed near the entrance glanced at them briefly, her lips tightening into a thin line before offering a curt nod. "Welcome to Bentley & Company," she said, her tone barely masking an undertone of skepticism. As Celeste admired a delicate gold bracelet encrusted with tiny sapphires, Damon leaned in closer to the counter. "This one's beautiful," he remarked. Before they could ask about the piece, the sales associate's eyes darted toward Marcus Caldwell, a security guard standing at the far end of the store. She motioned him over discreetly, whispering something into his ear. Marcus, a stocky man in his late 30s with a no-nonsense air about him, glanced at the Harpers and immediately stiffened. He didn't approach them at first, but observed from a distance, his expression growing colder with each passing second. In Marcus's mind, the Harpers didn't belong here. Their casual attire, Damon in a neatly pressed polo shirt and jeans, Celeste in a floral summer dress, seemed out of place amidst the designer-clad clientele. Memories of his late father's gruff warnings about people who don't know their place echoed in his head, fueling his distrust. When Damon gently picked up the bracelet to examine it, Marcus's suspicions hardened into certainty. "That's enough," he muttered under his breath, striding toward them with purpose. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice sharp and commanding as he approached the couple. "I'm going to need you both to step away from the counter." Damon blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness. "Step away? Is there a problem?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "We've had reports of suspicious behavior," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the sales associate, who now avoided eye contact. "I need to verify that everything's in order." Celeste leaned forward, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We don't want sympathy. What we want is accountability. We want change. Because this doesn't just affect us. It affects everyone who's ever been judged for something they can't change." Amelia observed quietly, jotting down notes. She could see the passion in their words, the deep well of pain and resilience that had brought them here. As the evening continued, audience members shared their own stories, of being followed in stores, of being stopped unnecessarily by police, of being overlooked or underestimated. Damon and Celeste listened, their presence a source of comfort and solidarity. By the time the event ended, the room felt charged with a sense of purpose. The Harpers left knowing they had taken the first step toward turning their pain into action. Back in her office, Lisa Brooks sat staring at her computer screen. The investigation into Marcus's actions was underway, but the pressure from corporate had only intensified. She rubbed her temples, exhausted from the constant barrage of emails and calls. A message popped up from the regional manager. "We need a public response by tomorrow. Draft something ASAP." Lisa sighed, the weight of her decisions growing heavier by the minute. She thought back to her conversation with Marcus earlier that day. He'd been defiant, unwilling to admit he might have been wrong. She knew he was a product of his environment, shaped by years of ingrained prejudice, but that didn't excuse his actions. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. Amelia Grant's article about the Harpers had just gone live. Lisa clicked the link and began to read, absorbing every word. The article was powerful, detailing the Harpers' experiences and framing their story as part of a larger issue. It didn't name Marcus directly, but it didn't have to. The incident had become symbolic of something far greater than one man's actions. Lisa leaned back in her chair, the words lingering in her mind. True accountability isn't just about consequences. It's about creating a culture where these incidents stop happening in the first place. She knew what she had to do. Marcus Caldwell grew up in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, a part of the city few outsiders ever ventured into unless they were lost. It was a place of cracked sidewalks, peeling paint on houses, and the ever-present hum of police sirens in the distance. He lived in a small two-bedroom apartment with his father, Ray Caldwell, and younger sister Tina. His mother had left when he was 6, unable to cope with Ray's drinking and the financial strain that had worn their family down to its last thread. For Marcus, the absence of his mother left a gaping hole that no one in his life ever truly filled. Ray was a foreman at a local factory, a man who worked hard but carried bitterness like a second skin. He often came home with the smell of sweat and machine oil clinging to him, and his temper simmered just beneath the surface. "Don't let them think you're weak, Marcus," Ray would say after finishing his second or third beer of the evening. "Weakness is what gets you trampled on in this world, especially by them." Marcus didn't have to ask who them referred to. His father's prejudice was a constant undercurrent in their home, disguised as warnings or life lessons. It wasn't just people of other races. Ray distrusted anyone he saw as different, anyone who didn't conform to his narrow worldview. At school, Marcus struggled to fit in. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but his father's lectures had instilled a defensive edge in him. He avoided friendships, always wary of getting too close to anyone. One afternoon when Marcus was 11, he got into a fight with a classmate named Jamal. It started over a misunderstanding. Jamal had borrowed Marcus's pencil without asking, but it quickly escalated. Marcus remembered the words spilling out of his mouth before he could stop them, words he'd heard his father say countless times. "You're just a troublemaker like the rest of them." Marcus spat, his fists clenched. Jamal froze, his eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" The fight that followed left Marcus with a black eye and a bruised ego. But worse than the physical pain was the shame he felt afterward. For weeks, he avoided Jamal and the other students who sided with him, isolating himself even further. As Marcus grew older, the lessons from his father became harder to reconcile with the world around him. He saw Ray lose his job at the factory during a round of layoffs, his anger turning inward as he spent more time drinking and less time looking for work. At 16, Marcus took on a part-time job at a grocery store to help support the family. The store was in a wealthier part of town, and Marcus quickly noticed the stark differences in how people were treated based on their appearance. Celeste's brow furrowed. "Suspicious? We were just looking, like everyone else in here." "That's enough," Marcus interrupted. "This isn't a debate. Step away, or I'll have to escort you out." Damon remained calm, raising a hand slightly to diffuse the tension. "We haven't done anything wrong. If you'd like, we can put the bracelet back and leave." Marcus crossed his arms, his tone hardening. "That's not how this works. Follow me to the security office so we can sort this out." Other shoppers began to notice the confrontation, their murmurs filling the air like static. Celeste's face burned with humiliation. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling. "We've done nothing wrong." "Ma'am, lower your voice," Marcus barked, taking a step closer. It was then that Damon's calm exterior faltered. "Sir, there's no reason to escalate this further. We're willing to leave. There's no need for theatrics." Marcus's eyes flicked toward the growing crowd, a mix of confusion and judgment etched on their faces. One young woman discreetly pulled out her phone, angling it to record the scene. "You're making a scene, not me," Marcus snapped, grabbing his radio. "I'm calling for backup if you don't comply." Celeste pulled Damon's arm. "Let's just go," she whispered, her voice strained with suppressed tears. "It's not worth it." But the damage was done. The humiliation lingered in the air, clinging to them like smoke as they turned to leave. Behind them, Marcus muttered into his radio, his voice clipped with self-satisfaction. Outside the jewelry store, the young woman who had recorded the incident quickly uploaded the video to social media. Her caption blunt, "Black couple harassed for shopping in luxury store." Within hours, the video gained traction, shared by influencers and activists alike. Comments poured in, many condemning Marcus's behavior as racially motivated. Back inside the mall, Marcus returned to his post, unaware that his actions had set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Damon and Celeste walked briskly through the crowded corridors of the mall, their earlier joy replaced by a heavy silence. Celeste's hands trembled as she clutched Damon's arm. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't do anything, and he treated us like criminals." Damon inhaled deeply, trying to steady his own rising frustration. "I know," he replied, keeping his tone calm for Celeste's sake. "But we can't let him take our day away from us. Let's just go home." Celeste stopped abruptly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Go home? Damon, this is the kind of thing that's been happening for generations. We can't just ignore it and walk away." Damon turned to face her, his expression softening. "I'm not ignoring it," he said gently. "But sometimes walking away is the only way to protect ourselves. I won't let that man's ignorance ruin what we've built." Behind them, murmurs rippled through the crowd as passers-by discussed the video that was already making rounds on social media. By the time the Harpers reached the parking lot, the weight of the incident had settled in fully. Celeste leaned against their car, her resolve cracking. How many more times, Damon? How many more times do we have to prove we belong in places like this? Damon placed a hand on her shoulder, his own frustration barely contained. We belong anywhere we choose to be, Celeste. Don't let one small-minded man make you question that. Meanwhile, inside the mall, Marcus stood rigidly at his post near the jewelry store. He was unaware of the storm brewing online, but the shift in the atmosphere around him was impossible to ignore. A few shoppers shot him disapproving glances as they passed. Some whispered to each other while casting lingering looks in his direction. The young woman who had recorded the confrontation re-entered the mall with two friends, her phone still in hand. "That's him," she said, nodding toward Marcus. One of her friends shook his head. "This is going to blow up," he muttered. "Good," she replied. "People like him need to be held accountable." The video had already been shared thousands of times. Comment sections were ablaze with debates over racial profiling and systemic bias. Some defended Marcus, claiming he was just doing his job, while others condemned him outright, calling for his dismissal. An hour later, Marcus's supervisor, Lisa Brooks, arrived at the mall. A composed and professional woman in her 40s, Lisa had been receiving calls and emails non-stop since the video surfaced. She approached Marcus with a stern expression. "Marcus," she said, folding her arms, "I need a word with you." He turned to her, his brows furrowing. "What's going on?" Lisa gestured for him to follow her into the security office. Once inside, she closed the door and sighed. "We have a problem, a big one." Marcus crossed his arms defensively. "If this is about the couple earlier, I was just doing my job." The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken until now. Marcus opened his mouth but couldn't find the right words. Lisa sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I don't have time for excuses. Corporate wants immediate action. You're suspended while we investigate. Effective immediately." Marcus stood abruptly, anger flashing across his face. "You're throwing me under the bus for doing my job." "I'm giving you time to think," Lisa replied calmly. "Take it." Outside the jewelry store, Damon and Celeste Harper sat in their car, parked in a quiet corner of the lot. The energy from the previous day's confrontation still clung to them, raw and unresolved. Celeste stared out the window, her reflection overlapping with the passing shoppers outside. "It wasn't just the way he looked at us," she murmured, her voice tight with emotion. "It was like he'd already decided who we were before we even spoke." Damon placed a hand on hers, grounding her. "I know, but we've been through worse, haven't we?" "Should we really just let this go?" Celeste asked, turning to him. "If we don't say something, who's to say he won't do it to someone else?" Damon's silence lingered before he nodded. "You're right. We'll talk about it. But let's go home for now." They drove off, the city skyline stretching in the distance as their thoughts churned with anger and determination. Later that afternoon, Damon and Celeste Harper sat in their living room, a quiet tension hanging between them. Celeste scrolled through her phone, reading messages of support and outrage from friends and strangers alike. "It's everywhere now," she said, breaking the silence. "People are standing up for us." Damon leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "That's good. But you know as well as I do, it's not enough to just go viral. This can't end with a video." Celeste nodded, her resolve firming. "Then we make sure it doesn't. We need to do something meaningful, Damon. Not just for us, for everyone who's ever been treated like we were." Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Amelia Grant, the young journalist who had reached out earlier that morning. "Mrs. Harper," Amelia said warmly, her voice steady and professional. "Thank you for taking my call again. I wanted to follow up and see if you'd be open to sharing your story in an interview. I believe this is an important moment, and your voices could really make an impact." Damon and Celeste exchanged a look. "All right," Celeste said after a moment. "Let's meet. But this isn't just about us. It's about making sure people understand the bigger picture." Amelia agreed, and they set a time to meet at a local community center that evening. Across town, Marcus sat slumped in his chair, staring at the muted television in his dimly lit apartment. Every channel seemed to be covering the incident, replaying the video over and over. He turned off the TV with a growl, but the silence was worse. His thoughts raced, replaying the encounter with the Harpers in vivid detail. For the first time, doubt began to creep in. Had he really acted out of suspicion? Or had his assumptions been rooted in something deeper, something uglier? A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was Tom again, holding 2 beers. "You look like you could use this," Tom said, stepping inside uninvited. Marcus accepted the beer but remained quiet. "You know," Tom began, settling into a chair across from him, "this whole thing's got people talking. Some are saying it's just cancel culture blowing up, but—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It doesn't look good, Marcus." Marcus stared at the floor. "I didn't mean for it to blow up like this. I was doing my job." "Were you?" Tom asked, his tone not accusing but curious. "Or were you doing what you thought was your job based on what you thought about them?" Marcus didn't respond. The question lingered, gnawing at him long after Tom left. At the community center that evening, Damon and Celeste sat on a small stage in front of an intimate crowd. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: teachers, parents, activists, and students, many of whom had experienced or witnessed similar injustices. Amelia Grant stood off to the side, her camera crew discreetly filming the event. She wanted the Harpers' voices to be heard as authentically as possible. Damon adjusted the microphone, his steady demeanor masking the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "What happened to us yesterday wasn't just about one guard making a bad call. It was about the assumptions that people make, the assumptions that are baked into our society, assumptions that hurt people like us every day." The crowd nodded in agreement, murmurs of affirmation rippling through the room. Lisa frowned, pulling out her phone and showing him the video. "This isn't just about your job, Marcus. This video is going viral. People are accusing you of racial profiling." Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched the video. "I didn't do anything wrong. They looked suspicious, and I followed protocol." "Protocol doesn't include humiliating paying customers," Lisa shot back. "You handled it poorly, and now we're in the middle of a PR nightmare." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when Lisa raised a hand. "Look, we're going to launch an investigation, but for now, I have no choice but to suspend you. Effective immediately." His face flushed with anger. "Suspend me? You're caving to public pressure instead of standing by your employee." Lisa's voice softened slightly. "This isn't about taking sides, Marcus. It's about damage control. Take the time to think about how this escalated and what could have been done differently." Marcus left the office in a huff, his mind racing. As he exited through the back of the mall, he noticed a group of young people staring at him, their phones pointed in his direction. "Smile for the camera," one of them jeered. Marcus quickened his pace, his heart pounding. For the first time, he felt the sting of public scrutiny, though his mind stubbornly clung to the belief that he had acted correctly. By the time he reached his car, Marcus's phone buzzed with notifications. Texts from co-workers, voicemails from family members, and email alerts all demanded his attention. He sank into the driver's seat, overwhelmed by the noise. As the evening wore on, the video continued to circulate, drawing the attention of local news outlets. Headlines such as "Security Guard Suspended After Racial Profiling Incident" and "Couple's Anniversary Soured by Discrimination" began to appear. For Damon and Celeste, the evening was somber but reflective. Sitting in their living room, Celeste scrolled through her phone, reading the flood of comments under the video. "People are standing up for us," she murmured. "Maybe this will finally make a difference." Damon nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe. But it shouldn't have taken this for people to see what we go through." They sat in silence, the weight of the day heavy but laced with a faint glimmer of hope. The early morning sunlight crept through Marcus Caldwell's blinds, but he barely noticed. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he'd woken up, and every alert made his stomach tighten. Sighing heavily, he finally grabbed the phone, scrolling through the endless notifications. What greeted him wasn't just another mundane work message. Instead, his name was plastered across headlines, accompanied by that now familiar image of him pointing sternly at Damon and Celeste in the jewelry store. His finger hovered over one of the links, hesitating before finally tapping it. A video played, showing the tense exchange in stark clarity. His sharp voice, his rigid posture, and the humiliation etched on Celeste's face as she clutched her husband's arm. He swiped the screen away, unable to bear the sight any longer. The unease he'd tried to suppress since yesterday began to crawl to the surface. For the first time, Marcus felt the weight of being seen, judged by thousands of strangers. The knock on his door startled him. Pulling on a shirt, he opened it to find his neighbor, Tom, standing there with a knowing look. "Morning," Tom said, holding up his phone. "So you're famous now?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "What's that supposed to mean?" Tom raised an eyebrow. "Don't play dumb. Everyone's seen the video. You've got half the city ready to string you up, and the other half, well, they're not exactly defending you." Marcus shut the door without another word, muttering to himself, "I didn't do anything wrong." Lisa Brooks had arrived at the mall early, but the air was already heavy with tension. Employees exchanged hushed whispers behind counters, their glances darting toward the main security office where she waited for Marcus to arrive. When he finally stepped through the door, Lisa gestured for him to sit. Marcus complied, though his expression was guarded, his jaw set in defiance. "I assume you've seen the video," Lisa began, her tone professional but clipped. "I've seen it," Marcus replied tersely. "And I don't see what the big deal is. I was just doing my job." Lisa studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. "Marcus, this is bigger than you. The public is angry, and they're calling this racial profiling. We're already seeing a backlash online. People boycotting the mall, negative press. Corporate is breathing down my neck." "That's not fair," Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "They were acting suspicious. I handled it the way I've always handled situations like that." Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what about this situation made you think they didn't belong there?" One day, a black man in his late 20s came into the store, dressed in worn jeans and a faded sweatshirt. Marcus watched as the manager, Mr. Porter, trailed the man through the aisles, his eyes narrowing every time the man stopped to pick up an item. When the man finally approached the register, Mr. Porter stepped forward. "Sir, can I help you find something?" The man looked confused. "No, I'm good." "Then I'd appreciate it if you kept your hands where I can see them," Porter said, his tone icy. Marcus watched the exchange with unease. He didn't understand why Porter was so suspicious. Nothing about the man's behavior seemed out of the ordinary. But as the customer left, muttering under his breath, Porter turned to Marcus and said, "You've got to keep an eye on them. Can't trust people like that." Those words stayed with Marcus, mingling with the lessons from his father and forming the foundation of a worldview he didn't yet have the tools to question. By the time Marcus graduated high school, his dreams of going to college had faded. Ray's health had deteriorated, and Marcus felt obligated to stay close to home to take care of his father and Tina. He took a series of odd jobs, each one reinforcing the beliefs he'd absorbed over the years. At 22, he applied to join the police force. It felt like a chance to do something meaningful, to prove himself. But Marcus failed the psychological evaluation, his defensive nature and difficulty working with others raising red flags for the evaluators. The rejection stung more than he cared to admit. When he returned home, Ray was sitting in his usual spot on the couch, a beer in one hand and the TV remote in the other. "They probably just didn't want another white man in the ranks," Ray said, his voice dripping with resentment. Marcus didn't respond, but part of him wanted to believe his father was right. It was easier than acknowledging the possibility that he might not be cut out for the job. By the time he reached his 30s, Marcus had settled into his role as a mall security guard. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave him a sense of authority he felt he'd been denied elsewhere. Yet, the lessons from his past lingered, shaping how he approached his work. He prided himself on being vigilant, on spotting trouble before it started. But his vigilance often veered into suspicion, particularly toward people who reminded him of the narratives his father had fed him. Marcus never saw himself as a racist. He told himself he was just doing his job, keeping people safe. But deep down, there was a part of him that knew he hadn't truly questioned the beliefs he'd carried with him for so long. Marcus's 20s blurred into a monotonous cycle of long shifts and quiet nights. The mall was his domain, a place where he could exert control and feel a semblance of authority. Yet, that control often came at the expense of others, particularly those who didn't fit the mold of the ideal shopper. One evening during his first year as a security guard, Marcus noticed a young black teenager in the food court, sitting alone with a backpack at his feet. The boy seemed nervous, glancing around as if he were waiting for someone. Marcus's instincts kicked in. He approached the boy, his tone firm. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" The boy looked up, startled. "Just waiting for my mum," he said quietly. Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Waiting, huh? Mind showing me what's in the bag?" The boy hesitated, his face flushing with embarrassment. "It's just school stuff." "Then you won't mind if I take a look," Marcus pressed. The boy reluctantly unzipped the bag, revealing textbooks, notebooks, and a half-eaten sandwich. Marcus felt a flicker of doubt, but quickly pushed it aside. "Next time, don't loiter. People might get the wrong idea." The boy nodded, hastily gathering his things and leaving. Marcus didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to another routine interaction. But years later, the memory resurfaced, accompanied by a nagging discomfort. The turning point in Marcus's life came when his father passed away unexpectedly. Ray Caldwell's health had been declining for years, the result of too many cigarettes, too much alcohol, and an untreated heart condition. Marcus found himself at a crossroads, burdened by grief and the responsibility of caring for Tina, who was now a college student working part-time to support herself. Going through Ray's belongings after the funeral, Marcus discovered a box of letters and mementos from the factory where his father had worked. Among them was a photograph of Ray and another man, both smiling proudly in front of a row of machinery. The back of the photo was inscribed, "Ray and Paul, best team in the plant. 1982." The name stirred something in Marcus's memory. He hadn't thought about Paul in years, the neighbor who used to bring groceries when the family was struggling, who had fixed Marcus's bike after he'd wrecked it in middle school. Paul was black. And yet, Ray had once considered him a friend. Marcus stared at the photo for a long time, his emotions churning. It didn't make sense. Ray had spent years warning Marcus about people like Paul, Yet here was evidence of a different story, a version of his father that Marcus had never known. He tucked the photograph back into the box, but the questions it raised lingered. In the years following Ray's death, Marcus became increasingly isolated. He poured himself into his work, using the mall as a refuge from his unsettled thoughts. But his interactions with shoppers became more rigid, his demeanor colder. One winter, a group of teenagers entered the mall, laughing and joking as they headed toward the food court. Among them was a boy wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up. Marcus immediately zeroed in on him, his mind flashing back to every lecture his father had given about troublemakers. "Excuse me," Marcus said, stepping into their path. "I need to speak with you for a moment." The boy looked confused. "Me? What did I do?" "Let's not make this difficult," Marcus replied, his voice clipped. "Where are you headed and what's in your pockets?" The other teenagers protested, but Marcus ignored them, his focus on the boy. After a tense exchange, the boy emptied his pockets, revealing nothing but a cell phone and some loose change. One of the teenagers muttered, "Man, you always go after us. We're not doing anything wrong." Marcus felt a flash of defensiveness. "I'm just doing my job," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. By the time Marcus reached his late 30s, he had become a creature of habit, his life defined by routine and the walls he had built around himself. He avoided meaningful connections, preferring the predictable solitude of his small apartment. But cracks had begun to form in his carefully constructed worldview. Moments from his past resurfaced at odd times: the boy with the backpack, the teenagers in the mall, Paul's photograph. Each memory chipped away at the certainty he once held, leaving behind a growing sense of unease. Marcus had always told himself that he was a protector, someone who kept the peace and ensured safety. But the events of his life, when laid bare, told a different story, one of assumptions, bias, and a refusal to confront the truths that made him uncomfortable. It was this unspoken conflict that Marcus carried with him into his confrontation with Damon and Celeste Harper. And though he didn't realize it at the time, their encounter would become the catalyst for a reckoning that had been years in the making. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of the Harpers' cozy living room, casting a warm glow over the chaos of the past few days. Celeste sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The video of the mall incident had gained millions of views overnight, and her email inbox was flooded with messages, some from supporters, others from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination. Damon entered the room, a cup of coffee in hand. He set it down in front of her and took a seat across the table. "Still going through the emails?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern. Celeste nodded, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "There are so many. People from all over the country, Damon. They're saying things like, 'This happened to me too,' or 'Thank you for speaking up.'" Damon leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's good that people are connecting with this, but we have to be careful. If we let it end with a viral video, nothing will really change." Celeste sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. But where do we even start? How do we turn this into something that actually makes a difference?" Before Damon could respond, Celeste's phone buzzed. It was a reminder for their meeting with Pastor Williams, a longtime family friend and advocate for social justice in the community. "Maybe we start there," Damon said, gesturing toward her phone. Later that day, Damon and Celeste arrived at the community church where Pastor Williams had agreed to meet them. The church was more than just a place of worship. It was a hub for activism, a gathering spot for people determined to create change. Pastor Williams greeted them warmly, his tall frame and gentle smile instantly putting them at ease. "Damon, Celeste," he said, ushering them into his office. "It's good to see you both, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "We appreciate you making time for us," Damon replied, shaking his hand. As they sat down, Pastor Williams leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've seen the video. It's heartbreaking, but unfortunately, it's not surprising. You're not the first and you won't be the last to experience something like this." Celeste nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "That's why we're here. We don't want this to just be another story that fades away. We want to do something meaningful." Pastor Williams listened intently as they shared their thoughts and ideas. When they finished, he smiled. "You're on the right track. Change starts with conversations, but it doesn't end there. I can connect you with local activists and organizers who can help amplify your voices." Damon and Celeste left the church feeling hopeful, their determination renewed. A week later, Celeste stood in the center of her art studio, surveying the pieces she had been working on for months. Her art was deeply personal, inspired by her experiences as a black woman navigating a world that often judged her by her skin color before her character. One painting in particular caught her eye, a swirling abstract of blues and golds depicting two hands reaching for each other across a fractured background. It was a reflection of her hope for connection and understanding in a divided world. "That's the one," Damon said from behind her, his voice breaking her reverie. Celeste turned to face him, a smile tugging at her lips. "The one for what?" "For the exhibition," Damon replied. "It's perfect." Celeste hesitated. "You really think people will come? That they'll care?" "They'll come," Damon assured her. "And if they care about the message as much as they care about the video, we'll be halfway there." A few days later, the exhibition took place at a local community center. The turnout was larger than Celeste had dared to hope. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers filed into the space, their expressions shifting between admiration and introspection as they moved from piece to piece. At the center of the room was Celeste's featured painting, titled "Bridging the Divide." Beneath it was a plaque that read, "In a world fractured by prejudice, let us be the hands that rebuild." Damon stood beside Celeste as she greeted attendees, his presence steady and supportive. When it was time for him to speak, he stepped onto a small stage set up at the far end of the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Damon began, his voice filling the room. "What happened to us was painful, but it wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern we see over and over again, not just here in Atlanta, but across the country." The audience listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. "We're not here to point fingers or assign blame," Damon continued. "We're here to ask for change, to ask for a world where no one has to question whether they belong." As Damon finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Celeste reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. As the applause faded, the audience lingered, forming small groups to discuss Damon's words and Celeste's art. The energy in the room was electric, charged with a collective determination to address the systemic bias that had shaped their lives. Celeste moved through the crowd, engaging with attendees who shared their own stories of discrimination. A middle-aged woman approached her, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Your painting," the woman began, gesturing toward Bridging the Divide. "It reminds me of something my son said to me. He told me he feels like he's always reaching for something he'll never be allowed to have. It's heartbreaking." Celeste placed a comforting hand on the woman's arm. "Your son's not alone," she said softly. "But that's why we're here, to make sure he knows he doesn't have to reach alone." Nearby, Damon was deep in conversation with Pastor Williams and a local activist named Sophia. Sophia was a passionate community organizer in her early 30s with a sharp mind and an infectious determination. We've been pushing for mandatory bias training in local businesses for years, Sophia said, her arms crossed. But stories like yours are what really make people listen. If you're willing, we'd love to have you join one of our upcoming forums. Damon nodded thoughtfully. We're willing. Whatever it takes to keep this momentum going. Pastor Williams smiled, placing a hand on Damon's shoulder. You've always had a way with people, Damon. Now's the time to use it. The following week, Damon and Celeste found themselves on stage again, this time at a packed community forum. The room was a mix of students, professionals, and activists, all eager to discuss solutions to the issues raised by the Harpers' experience. Damon adjusted the microphone, scanning the room before speaking. We've heard so many stories over the past few days, stories like ours, and some even worse. It's clear this isn't just about one incident. It's about a culture that allows these incidents to keep happening. Celeste stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. We've been asked how we stay hopeful after something like this. The truth is, it's not easy. But when we see all of you here, ready to stand with us, it reminds us that change is possible. The forum continued late into the evening, with attendees sharing ideas and strategies for combating racial bias in their communities. By the end of the night, Damon and Celeste felt a renewed sense of purpose. While the Harpers were building bridges, Marcus Caldwell was beginning to feel the consequences of his actions more acutely. His suspension had given him plenty of time to think, but the silence in his small apartment was deafening. One evening, he ventured out to a local diner for a change of scenery. As he sipped his coffee, he overheard a conversation at a nearby table. They're having another community meeting about that security guard, a young woman said, her voice dripping with disdain. I can't believe people like him still exist in this day and age. Her companion shook his head. It's not just him. He's part of a bigger problem. People need to be held accountable. Marcus stared into his coffee, their words ringing in his ears. For the first time, he began to see himself not just as an individual, but as part of a system that had allowed his biases to fester unchecked. A few days later, Marcus returned to the mall to meet with Lisa Brooks. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew he couldn't avoid the conversation forever. Lisa greeted him with her usual professional demeanor, but there was an edge of weariness in her voice. Marcus, thank you for coming. We need to talk about your next steps. Marcus nodded, sitting down across from her. I know I messed up, he began, his voice low. But I need to know if there's a way to make this right. Lisa studied him for a moment before responding. That's a good start, Marcus. Admitting you made a mistake is the first step, but making it right will take more than words. We're offering you the chance to participate in a comprehensive bias training program. It's not mandatory, but it's highly recommended. Marcus hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. And if I do it, will I get my job back? Lisa shook her head. That depends on the outcome of the investigation. But this isn't just about your job, Marcus. It's about how you move forward as a person. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment, staring at the flyer Lisa had given him. The words, "Unlearning Bias, a Path to Inclusion," were printed in bold letters across the top. He thought about his father, about the lessons he'd been taught and the ones he'd never questioned. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that those lessons had been wrong. Damon and Celeste's efforts began to pay off. Their story was featured in local news segments, and their voices were amplified by community leaders and activists. Celeste's art exhibition drew even more attention, with her painting Bridging the Divide becoming a symbol of hope for many. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Damon received a call from Pastor Williams. I thought you'd want to know, the pastor said. Marcus Caldwell has signed up for the bias training program. Damon raised an eyebrow, glancing at Celeste. I didn't think he'd take that step. Neither did I, Pastor Williams admitted. But maybe this is the beginning of something. Damon hung up the phone, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't ready to forgive Marcus, but he couldn't deny that this was a step in the right direction. Marcus sat at his small kitchen table, the cold fluorescent light above casting harsh shadows on the pile of unopened bills and scattered papers in front of him. The apartment felt emptier than usual, the silence stretching uncomfortably in every corner. The suspension from the mall had been swift and absolute. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was how quickly his reputation would follow him beyond the workplace. Jobs he'd once thought were always within reach now seemed impossible to secure. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell," one manager after another had told him over the phone. "We're not hiring at this time." Marcus knew what they really meant. The viral video had made him notorious, a name whispered in break rooms and shared in group chats. No one wanted the liability of hiring him. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it felt like to be judged on sight, to have a label pinned to him before he could open his mouth. The irony wasn't lost on him. One evening, desperate for fresh air, Marcus ventured to a local park. He kept his head low, his hood pulled up, hoping to avoid recognition. As he sat on a bench near the playground, watching children laugh and chase each other, his mind wandered to memories of his father. Ray Caldwell had always taught him to view the world through a lens of suspicion, to see every stranger as a potential threat. But now, as Marcus observed the joyful faces of the children and the trust between them and their parents, he wondered if his father's lessons had done more harm than good. A group of teenagers passed by, their laughter ringing out across the park. One of them, a tall boy in a red hoodie, caught Marcus's eye. He remembered the countless times he'd stopped kids like that in the mall, assuming the worst. His chest tightened with regret. How many times had he humiliated someone who was just minding their own business? How many apologies had he denied because he'd convinced himself he was right? A few days later, Marcus received an unexpected letter in the mail. The envelope was simple, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside, a neatly folded sheet of paper bore the names Damon and Celeste Harper at the bottom. Marcus's hands trembled as he unfolded it. "Dear Mr. Caldwell, we've thought long and hard about whether to reach out to you. After much discussion, we decided that if we truly want change, we can't just stand by and hope for it. We have to take steps toward it. What happened at the mall was hurtful. It was humiliating. And yet, we believe people are capable of growth. If there's even a small chance you're willing to reflect on what happened and take steps to understand why it was wrong, then this letter will be worth it. We're not writing this to excuse what happened or to erase the pain it caused, but we believe in the power of accountability and redemption. Change is never easy, but it's always possible. Sincerely, Damon and Celeste Harper Marcus read the letter twice, then a third time, his chest tightening with each word. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but it wasn't this. Their words weren't angry or accusatory. They weren't looking for revenge or even an apology. They were asking him to look inward, to take responsibility for his actions and choose a different path. For the first time, Marcus felt something crack open inside him. The next morning, Marcus picked up the flyer for the bias training program Lisa Brooks had given him. The words, "Unlearning Bias, a Path to Inclusion," seemed to leap off the page. He hesitated before dialing the number listed. The woman on the other end of the line sounded pleasant, but professional. "Thank you for calling," she said. "We're glad you're interested in joining the program. Our next session begins on Monday." Marcus jotted down the details, his hand shaking slightly as he hung up. This was the first step, he reminded himself. It wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. On the first day of the training, Marcus arrived at the community center feeling out of place. The room was filled with people from all walks of life. young professionals, retirees, teachers, and even a few police officers. The facilitator, a woman named Angela, began by asking everyone to introduce themselves and share why they were there. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood awkwardly, his voice faltering. "I'm Marcus," he began. I'm here because I need to understand some things about myself, things I've ignored for too long." Angela nodded, her expression encouraging. "That's a good place to start, Marcus. Awareness is the first step to change." The session was uncomfortable at times. Marcus found himself confronted with stories and perspectives he'd never considered, accounts of bias and discrimination from people who had lived through it. But as the hours passed, he felt something shift. For the first time, he began to see the world through a lens that wasn't clouded by his own assumptions. That evening, Marcus returned home exhausted but hopeful. He placed the Harpers' letter on the table, smoothing it out with care. He didn't know if they would ever forgive him, but he was starting to understand that forgiveness wasn't the point. What mattered was the effort he put into becoming better, not for them, but for himself and the people he would encounter in the future. The days that followed Marcus's first bias training session were filled with introspection. The stories shared during the session lingered in his mind. The man who was denied a job because of his name, the woman who was followed in a store, the young boy whose teacher assumed he wouldn't amount to much. Each story chipped away at the wall Marcus had built around his beliefs, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. One particular exercise from the training session haunted him. The facilitator, Angela, had asked participants to reflect on a time when they had made an assumption about someone and acted on it. Marcus thought about the young boy with the backpack, the teenagers in the food court, and most recently, Damon and Celeste Harper. In each instance, he'd convinced himself he was acting out of caution, out of duty. But now he wondered if those decisions had been driven by something else entirely, something he didn't want to admit. During one of the training sessions, Angela handed out a worksheet with a single question printed at the top. "What would it take for you to change?" Marcus stared at the question for a long time, his pen hovering over the blank page. Change, he realized, wasn't just about admitting he was wrong. It was about unlearning years of habits and beliefs, about choosing to see the world differently. When it was his turn to share, Marcus stood slowly. "It would take," he began, his voice halting. "It would take understanding the harm I've caused, really understanding it. And it would take being willing to do better, even when it's uncomfortable." Angela smiled, nodding. "That's an honest answer, Marcus. And that's where real change begins." After completing the training program, Marcus felt a cautious sense of hope. The sessions had been difficult, but they had opened his eyes in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, he decided to take a walk through the mall. It was a quiet night, and the usual crowds had thinned to a trickle of late-night shoppers. As he passed the jewelry store, he stopped, staring through the glass at the glittering displays. The store was empty, save for a lone sales associate tidying up behind the counter. Marcus hesitated, then stepped inside. The associate looked up, startled, but Marcus quickly held up a hand. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. I wanted to apologize for the way I handled things." The associate nodded, her expression softening. "We all make mistakes," she said quietly. "What matters is what we do after." A few days later, Marcus received another letter in the mail, this time from Pastor Williams. It was an invitation to a community forum where Damon and Celeste Harper would be speaking about their experiences and their efforts to promote change. Marcus wasn't sure if he was ready to face them, but something inside him urged him to go. The forum was held at the same community center where Marcus had attended his training. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds, the air buzzing with anticipation. Marcus slipped in quietly, taking a seat at the back of the room. He watched as Damon and Celeste stepped onto the stage, their presence commanding but unassuming. Damon spoke first, his voice steady and clear. When we talk about change, we often think about it in big, sweeping terms. But real change starts with small actions, choosing to listen, choosing to reflect, choosing to do better. Celeste followed, her tone warm but firm. We're not here to shame anyone. We're here to ask for something simple: accountability. Not just from individuals, but from the systems that shape our lives. As they spoke, Marcus felt a wave of emotions: guilt, admiration, and a deep yearning to be part of the solution rather than the problem. When the forum ended, attendees mingled, sharing stories and exchanging ideas. Marcus lingered near the back, unsure whether to approach Damon and Celeste. Eventually, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. Damon noticed him first, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Caldwell," Damon said, his tone neutral. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped in front of him. I wanted to thank you," he stammered, "for the letter, and for giving me a chance to do better." Celeste studied him for a moment, then offered a small nod. "Change isn't easy," she said, "but it's worth it." Damon extended a hand, his gaze steady. "It starts with showing up," he said, "and you're here. That's a step." Marcus shook his hand, the gesture simple but profound. As Marcus left the community center that night, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he saw a path forward, not one that would erase his mistakes, but one that would allow him to grow beyond them. And that, he realized, was enough. The community center buzzed with energy as people filed into the large hall. The room, adorned with artwork from local artists, was a vibrant mix of colors and textures. In the center of the room, Celeste Harper's latest piece, Bridging the Divide, stood on an easel. The painting was a swirl of gold and blue, two hands reaching for one another across a fractured background. The title was etched on a plaque below it, a reflection on reconciliation and the courage to build bridges. Damon and Celeste stood near the stage, greeting attendees as they arrived. The crowd was diverse: neighbors, activists, families, and even a few reporters. This was the first public event where the Harpers would speak since the incident at the mall, and the anticipation was palpable. Marcus Caldwell lingered outside the community center, his breath visible in the chilly evening air. He clutched a folded flyer in his hand, the words, "Community Forum Building Bridges," printed in bold letters across the top. He hadn't planned on coming. Even after completing the bias training program, Marcus wasn't sure he deserved to be here. But something about the Harper's letter and the way it had invited him to reflect without condemning him had stayed with him. Summoning his courage, Marcus stepped through the doors and into the brightly lit hall. His presence went unnoticed at first as he quietly took a seat in the back row. The event began with a welcome from Pastor Williams, who spoke about the importance of community and the power of reconciliation. "Tonight," he said, "we gather not to point fingers, but to open hearts. Real change begins when we are brave enough to listen and honest enough to reflect." Damon was the first to take the stage. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone, his calm demeanor commanding attention. "What happened to us at the mall was painful," Damon began, "but it wasn't unique. That's the truth we can't ignore. Incidents like that are part of a much larger pattern, a pattern rooted in assumptions, biases, and fear." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But we're not here to dwell on the past. We're here to talk about the future, about how we move forward together, because this isn't just about changing systems. It's about changing hearts. Applause rippled through the room as Damon stepped aside to let Celeste speak. Celeste's voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Art has always been my way of processing the world," she said, gesturing toward bridging the divide. "This painting represents the hope I hold on to, the hope that even in our most fractured moments, we can find the courage to reach for each other." Her gaze swept over the audience, her eyes landing briefly on Marcus. She didn't flinch, but held his gaze for a moment before continuing. "Reconciliation is hard. It takes effort, vulnerability, and a willingness to admit when we've been wrong. But it's possible, and that's why we're here tonight." As the event transitioned into an open forum, attendees lined up to share their thoughts and experiences. Some spoke about moments of discrimination they had faced, while others shared stories of connection and growth. Marcus sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Each story chipped away at his defenses, forcing him to confront the ways he had contributed to the very patterns these people were describing. Finally, Marcus stood, his legs trembling slightly as he made his way to the microphone. A hush fell over the room as people turned to look at him, some recognizing him immediately. "I don't know if I belong here," Marcus began, his voice low but steady. "I've spent most of my life making assumptions about people. I told myself it was part of my job, part of keeping people safe. But now I realize I wasn't protecting anyone. I was hurting them." He looked toward Damon and Celeste, his eyes filled with remorse. "I owe you both an apology. Not just for what happened at the mall, but for everything that led up to it, the biases I let fester, the choices I made that weren't fair. I'm sorry." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Damon stood, walking toward Marcus. He extended a hand, his expression unreadable but calm. "Acknowledging the harm is the first step," he said. "The next step is making sure it doesn't happen again." Marcus took his hand, the gesture simple but profound. As the evening wound down, people began to gather around Celeste's painting, discussing its themes and message. Marcus lingered near the back, watching as attendees engaged with the Harpers and each other. Before leaving, Marcus approached the painting. He stood in front of it for a long time, taking in the fractured background and the two hands reaching for one another. It was a powerful reminder of the work that lay ahead, not just for him, but for everyone. He left the community center that night feeling lighter, though he knew his journey was far from over. The road to redemption would be long, but for the first time, Marcus believed it was a road worth taking. The first time Marcus Caldwell stepped into the community center as a volunteer, he wasn't sure what to expect. The center buzzed with activity, children playing in one corner, adults sorting donations in another. It was a place filled with energy and purpose, a sharp contrast to the sterile, controlled environment of the mall where Marcus had spent so much of his career. Angela, the facilitator from his bias training program, greeted him warmly. "Glad you made it," she said, handing him a clipboard. "We've got plenty to do. Start by helping the kids set up their art supplies for the workshop." Marcus hesitated. "Art?" Angela smiled. "It's a way to help them express themselves, especially the ones dealing with tough situations. Don't worry, you don't have to be an artist. Just be present." As Marcus moved toward the group of children, he felt a pang of nervousness. He hadn't worked with kids before, and he worried they might see through him, sensing his lingering doubts and insecurities. But the children greeted him with curiosity and open smiles. One boy, no older than 10, tugged on his sleeve. "Can you help me draw a dragon?" Marcus nodded, pulling up a chair. "A dragon, huh? All right, let's see what we can do." As they sketched together, Marcus felt a sense of ease he hadn't experienced in years. The boy's trust, given so freely, reminded him of the potential for change, even in someone like himself. In the weeks that followed, Marcus became a regular at the center. He helped with everything from organizing supplies to mentoring teenagers who were navigating challenges he recognized all too well. One afternoon, while sorting donations, he overheard a commotion in the hallway. A young black teenager was arguing with a store manager, his voice rising in frustration. "I didn't take anything!" the boy exclaimed, his hands clenched into fists. The manager, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, pointed toward the door. "I saw you loitering near the shelves. If you're not buying anything, you need to leave." Marcus approached cautiously, the weight of his own past actions pressing heavily on him. He recognized the familiar pattern, the assumption, the escalation, the indignity. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. The manager turned to him, clearly annoyed. "This kid's been hanging around, making customers nervous." Marcus looked at the boy, who met his gaze with a mix of anger and fear. "What's your name?" Marcus asked gently. "Evan," the boy replied. "Evan, did you take anything?" "No," the boy said, his voice breaking. Marcus nodded. "All right, let's take a moment to calm down." He turned to the manager. "Do you have proof he did anything wrong?" The manager hesitated, his bluster faltering. "Well, no, but then maybe we should let him finish his business here," Marcus said evenly. After a tense pause, the manager relented, retreating with a grumble. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Evan's shoulder. "Thanks," Evan muttered, his eyes downcast. Marcus crouched slightly, meeting his gaze. "I know what it feels like to have people assume the worst about you, but it doesn't define who you are. Remember that." Evan nodded, a small smile breaking through his tension. Word of Marcus's involvement at the center began to spread. Damon and Celeste heard about his actions from Pastor Williams, who shared how Marcus had stepped in to help Evan. One evening, Marcus received a phone call from Damon. "I heard what you did for that boy," Damon said. "It sounds like you're trying to make things right." "I'm trying," Marcus replied, his voice hesitant. "I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I want to do better." Damon's tone softened. "That's all anyone can ask for. Keep at it." The conversation was brief, but it left Marcus feeling lighter. A month later, the community center held a celebration for its volunteers. Marcus was surprised when Angela asked him to speak. "I'm not much of a speaker," he said, scratching the back of his neck. Angela smiled. "You don't have to be. Just tell your story. People will listen." When the time came, Marcus stepped onto the small stage, the faces of volunteers and attendees looking up at him expectantly. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," Marcus began, his voice steady but humble. "I used to think I was just doing my job, but the truth is, I let my assumptions guide me, and those assumptions hurt people." He paused, glancing toward Damon and Celeste, who sat near the front. "It took a lot for me to see that, to really see it. But once I did, I knew I couldn't keep living the way I had been. I had to make a change, not just for myself, but for the people I've wronged and for those who come after me." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, the audience began to clap, the applause building into a standing ovation. As Marcus stepped down, Damon approached him, extending a hand. This time, there was no hesitation. "Keep going," Damon said simply. Marcus nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. The grand atrium of Willow Creek Mall buzzed with anticipation as a diverse crowd gathered for the evening's event. The space, once the site of the confrontation that had sparked a community-wide reckoning, was now transformed into a symbol of hope and change. Banners adorned the walls, reading, "Building Bridges, a celebration of growth and reconciliation." At the center of the stage stood Celeste Harper's painting, bridging the divide, its vibrant colors glowing under the soft lights. Damon and Celeste sat in the front row, their hands intertwined as they watched attendees mill about, chatting and admiring the artwork. Marcus Caldwell stood backstage, his heart pounding. He glanced at a small piece of paper in his hand, a few scribbled notes serving as his guide for the speech he was about to give. Public speaking had never been his strength, but tonight wasn't about him. It was about the journey that had brought them all here. As the event began, Pastor Williams took the stage, his deep voice resonating through the atrium. "Tonight," he said, "we are here not to dwell on the past, but to celebrate the power of transformation and the strength of community." He spoke briefly about the incident that had brought them together and the lessons it had inspired. Then, with a warm smile, he gestured toward Marcus. "Please welcome someone who has taken those lessons to heart and is here to share his journey with us." The audience applauded politely as Marcus stepped onto the stage. He adjusted the microphone, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as he took a deep breath. "When I stood in this mall months ago," Marcus began, his voice steady but low, "I thought I was protecting it. But I wasn't protecting anything. I was building walls between myself and the people I was supposed to serve. And those walls hurt people." He looked out into the audience, his gaze landing briefly on Damon and Celeste. "It took me a long time to see that. It took their courage, Damon and Celeste's, to help me realize how much harm I'd done. And it took their grace to show me that change is possible." The room was silent, every word carrying weight. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "Change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable. It's messy. But it's worth it. And it starts with acknowledging the harm we've caused and committing to do better." He gestured toward the painting behind him. "This artwork reminds us that even in our most fractured moments, we can choose to reach for one another. We can choose to build bridges instead of walls." As Marcus stepped down, the applause was thunderous. Damon and Celeste stood, leading the crowd in a standing ovation. Marcus nodded at them, gratitude etched on his face. After the speeches, the attendees mingled, their conversations filled with optimism and determination. Celeste's painting was auctioned off, with all proceeds going to community programs focused on education and equality. As the evening wound down, Damon, Celeste, and Marcus stood together near the painting. "You've come a long way," Damon said, his tone sincere. "And there's still a long way to go," Marcus replied. "But I'm ready for it." Celeste smiled. "That's all we can ask for." The event closed with a final message from Pastor Williams. "Tonight, we've seen the power of accountability, the strength of forgiveness, and the beauty of community. Let's carry these lessons forward and continue to build a better world together." This story reminds us that change is possible, no matter how deeply rooted our mistakes may be. It shows the power of accountability, forgiveness, and community in overcoming prejudice and creating a better future. What did you think about Marcus's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you've been inspired by this story, don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales that touch the soul and bring us closer together. Thank you for being a part of our community.